The MX missile is the subject now of the nuclear age.
This is an MX missile. It represents 30 years' endeavour by scientists and the military to build the best that technology could create. Yet the story of MX would become one of the most embarrassing chapters of the nuclear age. And the ability to fight a nuclear war and win would remain as elusive as ever.
Our profession. SAC's motto and its emblem are representative of its dual mission: to help maintain peace on our terms, and if deterrence fails, to counter aggression with devastating retaliation.
The age of the nuclear missile begins in 1960 with deployment of the first American ICBMs capable of hitting the Soviet Union. That was the voice of General Thomas Powers, Chief of SAC, Strategic Air Command, telling the American public about the latest military breakthrough.
First of SAC's operational ICBMs is the Atlas. The intercontinental ballistic missile can deliver a nuclear warhead to a target over 5,500 miles away in some 30 minutes.
But the Atlas was crude. It could do little more than hurl a single nuclear warhead in the general direction of Soviet cities. Yet along with SAC bombers, it served its purpose, threatening devastating retaliation to any aggressor.
The unmatched combination of SAC's unique organization, its weapon systems, bombers, missiles, and its men will continue to be the free world's most convincing argument for peace. For only the threat of devastating retaliation can keep potential aggressors from starting a nuclear holocaust.
For the Air Force, devastating retaliation was the only option they had, but it wasn't one they liked.
Soldiers don't get any pleasure out of killing civilians. All of their objectives are to try to attack the military or the infrastructure of an organization that they're at war with. The idea is not to kill all the people in a given nation, but to render that nation unable to continue the war.
By 1970, missile technology had come a long way since the Atlas. Minuteman III had 3 warheads, each of which could be sent to a different target. And it was more accurate than the older missiles, accurate enough to threaten Soviet missile command bunkers. This accuracy brought with it a new temptation. Could such missiles be used in a selective way against precise Soviet military targets without unleashing a full-scale nuclear war? NATO already had a policy for using nuclear weapons to stop a Soviet invasion of Europe. It was believed that a missile accurate enough to pick off military targets like tanks in their staging areas made that policy more credible.
We had to be able to employ nuclear weapons against a hypothetical Soviet attack in such a way that would not lead logically to the destruction of American cities, and therefore it must avoid logically the destruction of Soviet cities, which would inevitably set off such a Soviet response.
So began the concept of limited nuclear war, in which only military targets would be attacked. A change of strategy made possible by the new breed of accurate missiles. In 1974, the United States announced the change in its policy on nuclear targeting. Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger.
More effective deterrence of the possibility of strategic warfare, because it is known by all parties that the President of the United States has options other than the devastating option of going against the cities on the other side.
At that time, we really did not have the capability to do the kinds of things that our new philosophy specified. Our new philosophy demanded high accuracy and a large number of weapons to attack the various crucial targets with minimum collateral damage and with sufficient force to penetrate the hardness of those targets. I recall that Secretary Schlesinger said, by the way, our new policy is not going to be an excuse for you guys to go out and ask for a whole bunch of new capability.
But new capability, new weapons, was exactly what the Air Force wanted. Its Minutemen IIIs, they now said, just weren't enough to carry out that new policy and target all the Soviet missiles that had appeared since 1965. As so often in the nuclear age, the Soviets had not been standing still. To make their new multi-warhead missiles less vulnerable, they'd put them in silos hardened with concrete and steel. Now the Americans would have to score an almost direct hit to destroy them.
We had to have some more warheads. We also hoped that we could get a better warhead with better accuracy. And that was the real rationale for going into the MX.
And so the bizarre story of MX began to unfold. The MX, then on the drawing board, was seen as the solution to the problem. The Air Force said it could do it all. Like the Soviet SS-18, it would have 10 warheads. The missile's real strength was the accuracy of each warhead. At its heart was a highly sophisticated gyroscope. Tests showed the MX could withstand the forces of launch and deliver each warhead to within a few hundred feet of its target, close enough to destroy even a hardened Soviet silo. But such accuracy would add a new twist to the story. Before the era of super accuracy, missiles were seen as invulnerable. And since your own missiles were considered safe, there was no point in shooting first. But accurate missiles changed the logic of deterrence. Now, even a single enemy rocket equipped with multiple warheads could destroy several of your missiles still in their silos. So the temptation was to shoot first, before your missiles were hit by a surprise attack. This destabilizing effect would tighten still further the finger on the nuclear trigger.
You're going to detect that attack with at least 27 or 28 minutes of warning.
Check your combined display, 2. Quick alert! Quick alert! Quick alert!
You're going to know precisely the weight of that attack in 15 or 16 minutes. You're going to be able to make a decision to launch these missiles in, say, 5 or 6 minutes.
Good, into the valve, please.
And you're going to be able to launch the missiles in 1 or 2 minutes. And the missiles are going to be launched. And I know that, and the Soviets know that, and I know they know that.
Вот вам диалектическое противоречие. С одной стороны, я повышаю точность, мощность своих средств нападения, но с другой стороны, у моего вероятного противника рождается система, которая точно определяет возможности мои по нанесению внезапного первого удара. То есть я уже внезапность теряю. Я не могу выйти на противника, будучи незамеченным, а он, соответственно, зная, что я готовлю первый удар, свои ракеты, свои шахты освобождает от ракет. То есть удары получались какие? Встречные. И встречались эти ракеты на траектории подлета, значит, своего полета, подлета к целям. Здесь нет ракет, и здесь нет ракет. Зачем же контрсиловой удар? Зачем же первый?
That's the delicate balance of terror. No matter how difficult it is for us to assess and react, he must take into consideration how difficult it is going to be for him if we do.
A policy of launch under attack would put an enormous burden on early warning systems. In the view of most Pentagon experts, that burden was too great.
Such a plan is fraught with danger. One has terrible worries about whether our warning systems would give warning if an attack were underway. You have perhaps even greater worries about a false alarm. And you have to recognize that decisions on launch under attack would have to be made by fallible human beings in a moment of incredible stress and in a very short period of time. The national position has been, as long as I remember, and still is, that we should have the technical capability to launch under attack, but we shouldn't depend on it.
The obvious solution was to hide your missiles. Then your opponent couldn't find them and therefore couldn't destroy them. One early idea from the Air Force was to move the missiles around on trains. It was thrown out as implausible. But when the MX came to prominence in the early 70s, how to hide it became a major issue. The Air Force wanted the MX for its extra warheads and its accuracy. But for Congress, who provided the money, where to put the MX, the so-called basing system, was the overriding concern.
In 1976, when we first came to grips with the MX, the issue of whether we ought to build it in order to make our own missile force survivable, which then put the emphasis on the basing scheme, or whether we ought to build it in order to threaten their missiles and, in the judgment of many people, lead us to a hair trigger on both sides, was at the crux of the matter.
The debate over MX and how it should be based raised key questions that would dominate the early years of accurate multi-warhead missiles. What was more important for effective deterrence? The ability to threaten the missiles of the other side, or the ability to strike back if attacked? To be able to fight a limited nuclear war, or if war starts, to take your enemy with you into oblivion? The Air Force made half-hearted efforts to make its missiles safe from attack. It was testing air-launched ICBMs, flying missiles around in airplanes and launching them from parachutes. But most in the Air Force felt the best way to base the MX was in a simple silo. This was the quickest way to get the missile into action. But Congress objected.
The Congress said back loud and clear in writing to the President and the Air Force, we don't want to move to the next stage of development of the MX unless you can find a way of basing our missiles survivably. That's the problem we want to fix.
But it was a problem that wasn't easy to solve. This quarter-scale model of MX was being used to test the launch system. The Air Force originally planned simply to slip the missiles into converted Minuteman silos and eject them with a blast of steam. But it was now clear the Air Force wouldn't get approval for MX unless they could hide it to survive an attack. And that meant making it move.
Well, the MX was not the right missile to make move. It was too big. It was not designed as a mobile missile. And to make it mobile, we had to create a monstrosity.
If making the missile move was the price of congressional approval, the Air Force would oblige. It began testing a scheme that would involve digging a vast trench across the deserts of the American Southwest, a trench that would eventually run for thousands of miles. A concrete tunnel would be built in the trench. MX missiles would lie flat on rail cars and run up and down the tunnel on tracks. The Soviets wouldn't know where in the tunnel the missiles were located, so they couldn't target them. When the missiles were needed, they would break out through the roof of the tunnel, their launching tubes rearing up into a firing position. Already a technological monstrosity, the scheme became more and more absurd. What if Soviet rockets hit the tunnel? The blast wave would travel along it, destroying the rest of the missiles. The answer, a giant transportable plug was invented to stop the blast wave sweeping along the tunnel. Yet ironically, Congress had asked the Air Force to solve a problem that didn't even exist. The risk of a Soviet first strike was a myth. They didn't have the missiles to launch one.
Ну, СС-18, СС-19, я хочу сказать, что они не создавались как системы первого удара. Они просто не могли получиться в тот период. Дело в том, что это очень мощные ракеты с большой нагрузкой, так сказать, ядерной, но весьма малая точность была. Я вам как ракетчик скажу, что у нас точность была на порядок хуже, чем у американцев.
Yet Soviet engineers were working hard to improve the accuracy of their missiles. In doing so, they would unwittingly fulfill the predictions of a group of Washington hawks known as the B Team.
The B Team in '76 warned that there would be far more rapid advances by the Soviet Union in the number of MIRV reentry vehicles and in the accuracy of those vehicles than the intelligence community then projected. We felt that there would be a window of vulnerability by the early 1980s.
The idea of a window of vulnerability was that a Soviet attack would wipe out the entire American arsenal of missiles accurate enough to hit selected military targets. This would leave the US with missiles only on its submarines. These were accurate enough only for larger targets such as Soviet cities. Then it was argued, rather than risk a counterattack against American cities, the president might choose to surrender. To many, this idea was nonsense, since no nuclear war, they believed, could stay limited. A Soviet attack against American missile silos would still kill millions of civilians with fallout. This, in turn, they said, would invite massive retaliation by the United States. But the fears of a window of vulnerability added new voices to those who pressed for a missile that could survive an all-out attack. In the Washington of early 1977, however, all the arguments in favor of MX missed the target. Jimmy Carter came to office committed to arms control and firmly opposed to MX. He was repelled by the very idea of a nuclear war. And his advisors told him there was no such Soviet intention of a first strike, whatever might be said by the B Team.
Carter administration came in 1977 and not only ignored the B Team report because it conflicted with what it preferred to view as reality, it intentionally threw the B Team report out.
The MX nearly went with it. What saved the new missile was a technological breakthrough in the Soviet Union. Tests of an improved version of the SS-18 seemed to give credence to the worst fears of the B Team.
И когда на эту систему поставили более совершенные, на СС-18-19, более совершенные системы управления, мы, к своему удивлению, но американцы к своему ужасу, обнаружили, что, в общем-то, эта система может решать задачи первого удара.
US monitoring stations quickly discovered the bad news. What had until now been only a hypothetical nightmare suddenly became real.
The evidence suggested that this modification was to make about a twofold increase in accuracy in the missile, and that would achieve a level of accuracy with the size of the warhead on that missile, which could indeed pose a substantial threat to our missiles in their silos. And so that took the vulnerability issue from the back burner and moved it up to the front burner.
This Soviet success meant taking a new look at the MX. The Air Force, to satisfy Congress, had been reluctantly looking for ways to hide the missile. Now, for the Air Force, its ability to survive an attack was its biggest selling point. But the buried tunnel approach was looking increasingly far-fetched. The Air Force put a team together to look for alternatives. It was headed by General John Toomey.
Many of my soldier friends would come to me and say, I don't understand how you guys could possibly work 2 years on finding this concept. He said, I've got the solution. You get these trucks, you put the missiles on the trucks, and then you drive them around the streets of America. The Soviets could never know where they're going to be. And that sort of thing is an example. In fact, Art Buchwald had his solution was Amtrak. We know they'd be safe on Amtrak because nobody knows where Amtrak is at any given time. They're never on time, and their locations are unknown. And that's obviously, that's not obviously, but it's probably a workable scheme, except that it violates one of the fundamental constraints is we don't think the American people are going to tolerate having 10 megatons of nuclear weapons driving down the railroad tracks in the center of town and pulling into Union Station.
As the US Air Force experimented in the desert with ever more bizarre ways to hide the MX, President Jimmy Carter struggled with a simple question. Why bother with the MX in the first place? He didn't share the desire of the Air Force to add several thousand accurate new warheads to the nation's already overblown inventory. And if the only reason for MX was its ability to hide and strike back, then the US already had a mobile strike force with its submarines. The new Trident submarines would have multi-warheads that would give America all the firepower it needed. If it was so hard for the Air Force to find a basing mode as survivable as the Navy's submarines, why not abandon the land-based missiles and leave American nuclear security to the subs and bombers?
I would say the pivotal argument for proceeding with the MX was that when the president asked Harold Brown and asked myself the critical question, which is, can you assure me that not just today, but 10 years in the future or 20 years in the future, that the submarines will be as invulnerable to attack as they are today? The answer was no. We could not assure him of that. So the president then perceived the specter that if he then narrowed his strategic forces down to simply the submarines, and then if the Soviets were to make a breakthrough in submarine detection, so that the submarines could now be discovered at sea, now you have the most vulnerable system of all, because there's nothing more vulnerable than a submarine if you know where it is.
I've only got one life to live, and one opportunity.
But there was another powerful reason for Carter to build the MX.
I will never have a chance so momentous to contribute to world peace as to negotiate and to see ratified this SALT treaty.
President Carter was about to sign the SALT Treaty, a treaty designed to reduce nuclear stockpiles. But to get it passed by Congress, he would need military support. And the price for that was the MX.
Can you talk to us about the MX, your decision? Will you tell us exactly what it was?
In June 1979, Carter reluctantly gave the go-ahead for the new missile. There was just one little problem. How would it be based?
How is it going to be based?
That would be determined later.
That decision has not yet been made?
No, it's in the process of being made, but the president will decide that in the course of the next several weeks.
But there was yet another headache. There was disagreement over the size of MX. The Air Force wanted the biggest missile possible under the terms of the new SALT Treaty, to threaten as many Soviet targets as possible. But if the justification for the missile was its ability to move, then the smaller it was, the better. It would be easier to move around and to hide. But the big missile lobby won the day. Bill Perry was on the losing side.
I have always believed, but I couldn't prove, that the biggest factor that led to the big missile argument was the anti-wimp factor, which is that it seemed like a wimpy thing to do to build such a little bitty missile when the Soviets had these big, manly missiles.
Once again, common sense played a minor role in the MX debate. A big missile made the basing problem even more complicated. Keeping the MX safe meant constantly moving the missile from one silo to another. Now they had to move a monster.
And when you start moving around something that weighs 200,000 pounds and is approximately 100 feet tall, it gets rather difficult, it gets cumbersome, it's unaesthetic.
And there was yet another problem. The new SALT Treaty set out that each side was allowed to count the other side's missiles by spy satellite. How could the Soviets know how many MXs the Americans had without also knowing where they were? The answer was another even more bizarre scheme, the racetrack. The new plan used a giant transporter to shuttle one missile around between 23 shelters arranged in a loop. From time to time, the roofs of all the shelters would be opened simultaneously so that a satellite could verify there was only one missile in each loop. Then, with all the roofs closed, the transporter would whisk the missile at high speed to any one of the other 22 shelters.
The response to that system was really the response to every MX basing scheme that's ever been made, is there must be a better way, go back and find it. So we thrashed around for maybe another 6 months looking at alternative schemes, and if that one was Rube Goldberg, you should have seen some of the other schemes we looked at. But this time we dug in our heels and came back and said, no, this is the right way to do it. This is the best we can do. Called for a meeting of the National Security Council on the subject, got the meeting, and to make a long story short, it was approved.
At the time that I made the decision to build the MX, I established 5...
In September 1979, President Carter announced that 200 MX missiles would be built and deployed in a complex of 4,600 shelters in the American West.
It's a system that America needs and will have for its security. I'm confident that the American people will support this deployment.
The MX was on its way at last. The Air Force began surveying the deserts of Utah and Nevada to prepare for deployment, pleased it would finally have its big, accurate missiles, and busily digging holes in return for defense budget dollars. Those more concerned with the vulnerability of missiles were also happy. Now the MX would be hidden in more than 40,000 square miles of desert. The experts and the politicians were on board. Now the MX was to meet the American public, the people it was meant to defend.
Well, the one MX, that site, or cluster, or pod, or whatever we choose to call it, would have been built just beyond this black cinder cone there is on the horizon there. And of course, it would have been just that close in proximity to the ranch. And then the railroad would have been built up entirely up the valley, coming out on up the valley here.
Cecil Garland, a veteran of World War II, ranches in western Utah. He attended one of the earliest meetings at which the Air Force explained their plans to local residents.
To watch and see what happens to the levels and the actifers.
You know, I haven't seen so much brass since the Battle of the Bow. They're going to come hell or high water, and they don't care what they're going to do to my desert where I live. It's an invasion, an encroachment law. And I can't talk to these people.
A lot of people here tonight, I think, believe it is a foregone conclusion that no matter what they say or do, MX will be built in Utah, even if there is opposition from the people.
Well, the ultimate decision to deploy MX is certainly a national decision, which will take into account the feelings and the attitudes of the people in the deployment area.
And of course, he kept, telling us that this was good for us. And in spite of all our suspicions, concerns, and worries and cares about our land, our water, our ranches, and the valleys, and our way of life, still, this was good for us. And just relax and enjoy it. And the more that they tried to reassure us, I guess the more concerned and suspicious we came.
I'm Major Bill Clapper of the Ballistic...
But the more and more the MX system was explained, the less and less the people liked it. They realized that if the missile was ever used, the whole of Utah would be laid waste by incoming Soviet missiles. An Air Force film didn't help to allay their fears.
So to be sure of destroying that one missile and its 10 deadly warheads, an attacker will have to destroy all of its shelters. That means a minimum of 23 of their most accurate warheads to destroy only one missile. And the MX force will have 200 missiles.
As the debate continued, the public began to question the real role of MX.
MX was not a defensive weapon. It was a first strike weapon. And we know this was so because it had terrible accuracy. The military said that it had surgical accuracy, whatever that is.
There was a paradox in having an accurate missile built for survival. If it did survive a Soviet attack, what would be its target when it struck back? By now, Soviet missile silos would be empty. Perhaps the real reason was more sinister, that the Air Force, unlike Congress, never intended to wait for a Soviet attack.
Stop MX! Stop MX!
More and more people were seeing the MX as a first strike weapon.
Stop MX! Stop MX! Stop MX! Stop MX! Stop MX!
Live from Symphony Hall in Salt Lake City, a special edition of Bill Moyer's Journal, the MX Debate.
In 1980, the MX debate went national, in a live 2-hour debate on public television. There was a panel of experts and Cecil Garland.
I had the statistics about land and water and cattle and grazing and all wrote down, and I was going to talk about that. But the more I heard from the world's great experts on how to kill millions and millions and millions of the people of this earth with the least cost and expense and the most efficiently, I guess I sort of became repelled by the whole idea, and I just threw my statistics away, and I said, it seems to me that this discussion has degenerated into how we should deploy the missile of the 3 modes. The land mode, or the sea mode, or the air mode. And I'd like to suggest 4th mode. I call it the COM mode.
To the dismay of the Air Force, its carefully crafted plan for the MX was fast becoming a national joke. In an effort to make the scheme more credible, the need for high-speed movement between shelters was eliminated. Instead, a more stately but still immense transporter would move the missiles from one shelter to another. But since this meant moving the missiles quite slowly, it became easier for an enemy to track them. It was more important than ever to keep the real location of the missiles secret.
We looked at every possible espionage method that the Soviets could use, from satellites to agents riding around the desert in Winnebagos, crammed with electronic gear. And in fact, the Air Force had done the same thing and had decided to, instead of leaving the shelters that didn't have an MX missile empty, instead they were going to put a dummy in. That dummy, the official name for the dummy was a mass simulator. And so in each cluster of 23 shelters, there would be 1 MX missile and 22 mass simulators. And what we found is that gradually we learned that you had to make that mass simulator look more and more like a missile. You had to, for example, paint it with the right paints, because paints have an odor that can be detected with chemical sensors, and so forth, so that this thing smelled, looked, tasted, and behaved in all ways like an MX missile. And that was pretty complicated and I guess ultimately got rather bizarre.
Most of the complications came from rules proposed under SALT II, that the Soviets be able to verify how many missiles the Americans possessed. SALT II was anathema to most conservatives, who by then were rallying round presidential candidate Ronald Reagan. For Reagan himself, one way to win the election was to whip up the threat of rampant, aggressive communism, and the voters believed him.
We have let our ability to defend ourselves be reduced to the point that there is what the military now calls a window of vulnerability through which that imperialistic power could one day issue an ultimatum.
But while Reagan campaigned in support of the idea of a window of vulnerability, he poured scorn on Carter's solution.
The plan that has been submitted is going to, if I understand it correctly, require about 4,000 miles of tunnels and trenches in which those...
And tracks.
Yes, in which those missiles would maneuver. That seems a kind of a Rube Goldberg idea to begin with. Tremendously costly and can't be implemented for quite a number of years.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute...
Carter had chosen a missile system built for survival, a missile that complied with SALT II. But by now, SALT II was declared dead, and to newly elected President Reagan, the Carter plan meant waiting far too long to give America the extra nuclear clout of the MX system. MX missile itself was progressing on schedule. All 4 stages of the missile were successfully tested. Development of the warheads and guidance system was on time. So why not cancel the Carter basing scheme and come up with something more simple that could get the MX into service more quickly?
This program will achieve 3 objectives.
In October 1981, Reagan cancelled the Carter scheme, but his expert panel had been unable to come up with an alternative. To speed up deployment, there was only one option: put the MX back into the silos built for it in the first place.
We will complete the MX missile, which is much more powerful and accurate than our current Minuteman missiles. And we will deploy a limited number of the MX missiles in existing silos as soon as possible.
After 6 years of Heath Robinson schemes and far-fetched proposals, the MX was literally back where it began.
If there is or will be a window of vulnerability, why is the MX any less vulnerable if it's in silos, the location of which the Soviets presumably already know, unless we were going to launch on their attack?
I don't know, but maybe you haven't gotten into the area that I'm going to turn over to the, Secretary of Defense.
Because the silos will be hardened.
Yes. I could say this. The plan also includes the hardening of silos so that they are protected against nuclear attack. Now, we know that is not permanent. We know that they can then improve their accuracy, their power, and their ability. But it will take them some time to do that, and they will have to devote an effort, a decided effort to doing that.
So this is a way then of buying time, sir?
In a way of narrowing that window of vulnerability.
The man who had helped invent the window of vulnerability was disappointed.
The candidate who campaigned on the window of vulnerability not only did not proceed to close that window of vulnerability, but open it wider.
The deepest concern, of course, that the Air Force had was that in the absence of a basing mode, we felt that the Congress, or many thinking people, would simply not be in favor of the MX system at all.
Lou Allen's concern was well-founded. For 6 years, Congress had demanded that the MX must be able to survive a Soviet attack. Now on Capitol Hill, even defense-minded senators like Scoop Jackson began asking awkward questions.
System is not survivable as proposed.
Senator, I don't think that at this point there is anything that you can guarantee is going to be perfect. And what we need to do is to get the added strength that we can get as quickly as we can, and meanwhile, start the search for something that is even better.
Congress reacted to the silo proposal as it had in 1976. It turned it down and ordered the administration to come up with something better by December 1982. And it was then, from out of the blue, that a new, seemingly perfect solution emerged. The idea was to build super-strong silos that would need almost a direct hit to destroy them. And instead of spacing out the silos, as in earlier schemes, the trick this time was to pack them very closely together. Incoming warheads would themselves have to explode close together and would blow each other up before they could blow up the silos. When the attack was over, the missiles that survived would rise up through the debris and fire back. The idea, called dense pack, had another attraction compared to earlier solutions. Dense pack took up a strip of land just 1 mile by 14.
So it had the advantage of seemingly pleasing everyone. It was survivable, it was clever, it was cheap, and it didn't take up much land. The only problem was that as near as we could tell, it might not work.
Unfortunately for the Reagan administration, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were afraid dense pack might not make it through a Congress full of skeptics.
It is not perfect, and we are not aware of any mode that is perfect.
The public's got the idea that it's a boondoggle, a Rube Goldberg.
The dense pack basing mode is in deep political trouble.
So deep was dense pack's political trouble that even a last-minute appeal by the president at a Republican Christmas party could not sell the scheme to congressmen.
We must act seriously with the choices that we make. Now, I won't take this opportunity at a social gathering like this to twist your arms much. I'll just tell you now that we can look each other in the eye. The MX system is needed.
But needed for what? A conference of party leaders confirmed Congress's opinion that MX was meant to stop a nuclear war ever happening, not to make it possible to fight one. Therefore, MX must be able to survive. Again, Congress refused to fund it unless it could. 1983 began with a mood of deep frustration in the White House. There had to be some plan for MX that Congress would buy, but Congress gave the Reagan administration only 3 months to solve the problem. In desperation, Reagan set up an all-party commission of defense experts.
Perhaps while you are here and to give you some action in this, rather than waiting, I will sign the executive order which creates this commission.
It was headed by retired General Brent Scowcroft.
There. We're official.
Good. My notion was that the task was to find a decent burial for the MX, because I was dubious that a solution to the problem could be found. But then gradually, as we got into it, it didn't look quite so hopeless.
Commission members all agreed the MX should be built, if only to end the embarrassing years of wrangling. As to how it should be based, tests of the launch system were going well. For the Commission, there just seemed no alternative to putting the missile in the silos designed for it in the beginning. The task now was to sell the silo option, after years of saying that this very option would make the missile vulnerable. Commission witness Al Carnesale.
We have so many weapons of so many different kinds deployed in so many ways that the notion that the Soviets would launch a first strike because they could get some tiny fraction of them, namely these MXs, is silly. We were talking about deploying, imagine 100 MXs. That would be 1,000 nuclear warheads. The United States has about 12,000 nuclear warheads directed at the Soviet Union. If they could get that 1,000 that are in the MX silos, they still have another 11,000. They're going to be headed at the Soviet Union. We only have about 20% of our nuclear warheads in our land-based ICBM force. The rest are on bombers and cruise missiles and at sea. And those are the long-range weapons that can reach the Soviet Union. So these people had the argument right in that it does undermine stability by putting MXs in silos, but by very, very little in a scenario that's very unrealistic.
But some people argued this might not always be the case, once Soviet submarines were given accurate missiles. With only a 15-minute flight time, missiles launched from subs could, conceivably, hit both the US bomber force and its long-range rockets in a lightning first strike. This would leave the entire burden of defending America on the US submarine fleet. To silence this argument, the Commission recommended yet another missile, known as Midget Man. This would be small enough to be mobile and could be carried continuously around military reservations on its own launchers. Midget Man could move quickly and would be almost impossible to hit. Finally, Scowcroft produced his compromise formula. First, build just 100 MX missiles and put them in silos. This would avoid being provocative to the Soviets. Second, develop the Midget Man. And in parallel with this, try to achieve a more stable balance of forces with the Soviet Union. There was something for everyone.
We got, in a political sense, people who supported the MX would accept the small missile as a way to get the MX. People who didn't like the MX but liked the small missile but would accept the MX because of the small missile. And people who perhaps didn't feel any modernization was necessary, but in order to get the Reagan administration active in arms control, would support a strategic modernization. So that from a purely political sense, it was that kind of a combination which got a variety of different coalitions together.
An important member of that coalition was a somewhat reluctant Secretary of Defense.
I wasn't happy with some of the recommendations. I was happy with the fact that they endorsed completely the entire modernization plan of the president and said that it should proceed and that we should put the MX in existing silos, that it was vitally necessary to do this and do it as quickly as possible. That's the part I liked. But then they said the political realities are that in order to do this, you have to satisfy the small missile people. So after you do all of these things with that the president recommended, then in order to get some votes, you've got to give the small missile people what they wanted. And I thought that was pretty silly.
In May 1983, the House of Representatives debated the Scowcroft Compromise.
What was the reason we needed an MX missile system? We needed mobility. What do they plan to do with the MX missile system? Make it stationary. Make your own jokes.
It is not just the MX in a basing mode. It's a combination of an MX, a small missile, a new arms control. This is a different thing.
To great relief, the compromise passed. Nearly 10 years after the MX was conceived, its production was approved. 3 weeks later, the MX flew for the first time in a faultless test. But almost immediately, the shaky political compromise began to fall apart. Congress was still far from happy with putting the MX in silos and set a ceiling on production of 50 missiles unless a better system could be found. The Air Force was back where it began 10 years before, and it came up with the same old solution, a train. The selling started all over again, complete this time with a model railway to help convince the skeptics.
The train would move about the rail system or be secretly stopped in various locations, and if the president chose to launch one of these missiles, the top would come up, the missile would erect, and the crew would launch the missile.
What the Air Force would like is as many MXs as it can get deployed as cheaply as possible. Their first choice would be to put them in Minuteman silos. If those civilians and members of Congress who are so concerned about vulnerability will not permit them to do that, the Air Force is essentially saying, well, how will you let me deploy them? You want them on hay wagons? I'll put them on hay wagons. You want them in trains? I'll put them on trains. If they have to be on trains, I prefer they be on trains that don't move, because that would be cheaper.
Meanwhile, work has started on Midget Man. But Midget Man is not popular with the Air Force. Unlike the MX, it doesn't give much bang for the buck. The 50 MX missiles approved by Congress are now deployed in converted Minutemen silos in Wyoming, adding to the nearly 1,000 Minutemen that today are the real backbone of the US land-based deterrent. The future of both Midget Man and the MX is now a headache for President George Bush. MX cost over $30,000 million and has pleased no one. It symbolizes a clash between two competing philosophies, between those who believe a nuclear war can be prevented by being prepared to fight one, and those who believe that deterrence is served best by making nuclear war unwinnable and therefore unthinkable. In the end, the MX became little more than a farce. There aren't enough MX warheads to give even a theoretical advantage in a nuclear war. And based in its silo, it would be an early victim of any Soviet attack. The MX missiles are buried here in Wyoming, ready to be fired at an enemy. But despite their massive power, they are little more than a legacy of perhaps the most bizarre, most costly, and at times the most tragically comic episode of the nuclear age.